Senator from Orangeburg recommended we do, which is wise. But just wanted to make a few points. And first of all, I spent a fair amount of time studying this last year because I got appointed subcommittee chairman at the very end of the year, but never had a subcommittee meeting because it was no way we could get anything done. But I did spend a fair amount of time studying it. And I really started from a position probably of not supporting an Article 5 convention because of two things. A concern about the convention being a, quote, runaway convention, and number two, and most importantly, my concern about the state of American culture. I don't think that we have the same set of presuppositions and values, and most importantly, belief about human nature that the founders had. And I think the founders had human nature right. They greatly distrusted human nature. And if you don't, that's their number one guiding principle, really, when you look at the Constitution. I mean, that's what's behind the separation of powers doctrine. That's what's behind the Bill of Rights. That's what's behind federalism, where they created state and federal governments, each with authority in different areas. They did not trust people to wield concentrated political power. I mean, that is a resounding, clear message that they have sent through the ages, and they got it right. They got it right because it's the structure of government they created that preserves liberty. It's not faith in a person, a particular elected official. I think our culture has rejected that idea, or they're not even cognizant about it by and large, which is a shame. So I don't have a lot of. I'm concerned about the state of American culture and whether it would produce the type of document that the founders produced. So those are the concerns that I've had. But the more I studied this, the more I realized that this very same thinkers who I look to and love, like Madison and George Mason, who helped put the separation of powers doctrine and put those principles in the Constitution, looked at this as a means for the states to have some form of redress when the federal government becomes too powerful, when the balance of federalism is disrupted. I think on many fronts, it's pretty clear to me anyway that the balance of federalism has been disrupted by the federal government. And I'll quote Samuel Jones. He was a New York legislator. I think this was from the ratifying convention. And by the way, the founders, a lot of people say, we don't know what conventions are. I mean, conventions are ad hoc, organized groups in order to solve and address a political issue, and then they go away. And the founders had a lot of experience with conventions. The senator from Aiken 2 years ago sent me a book in the mail during the off season when we weren't in session, and it's called Ratification. It was a history of the ratification process in the states. Very, very interesting book, but it was done by conventions. I mean, the founders, the First Continental Congress was technically a convention. So when the founders created a convention and said this will be for this particular purpose, they had concrete examples of what they had in mind, that the conventions. And those conventions were limited to their purpose. In practice, they were. I mean, there weren't any runaway conventions in their experience. There was a lot of conventions throughout the colonial era and into the ratification of the federal Constitution. So if the federal judiciary would take that history and that precedence and really look for the original intent, which I doubt that they would, I'm afraid to say, but if they did, what they should do, they would limit a convention to what we say the convention should deal with in this resolution. But Samuel Jones says this: the reason why there are two modes of obtaining amendments prescribed in the Constitution, the first is the Congress proposing amendments, and the second is the Article 5 Convention of the States. The reason there are two modes, I suppose, to be this: it could not be known to the framers of the Constitution whether there was too much power given by it or too little. They therefore prescribed a mode by which Congress might by which Congress might procure more if in the operation of the government it was found necessary, and they prescribe for the states a mode of restraining the powers of the federal government if upon trial and error and experience it should be found necessary. And so that's the reason they gave the states a mechanism, because when they created the federal government, you know, they didn't know how it was going to pan out. Now, I think it's panned out very well. But we also have seen, I mean, look at the federal debt situation, for example. We're almost 80% of the GDP. We have a spike now that looks like almost like the spike that occurred during World War II. And these things, and James Madison in Federalist 43, he said the Constitution equally enables the general or the federal and the state governments to originate the amendment of errors as they may be pointed out by experience on one side or the other. I mean, Madison looked at this as a legitimate process. In fact, Madison cited it during the nullification crisis of 1832. We talked about the nullification crisis a lot several years ago. And so you see that, I mean, the founders had a concrete notion of what a convention was, and they saw it as something for the states to use if the federal government grows too much in power. In fact, the 17th Amendment, which was adopted in 1911, which provided for the popular election of senators. And that was a goal of the progressive movement in the early 20th century to make that happen. And that did a lot, that changed the dynamics of federalism significantly, because when senators were appointed by state legislatures, they represented the state. They had the idea of what the states needed, you know, more so in their mind. And that was one of the balances of federalism that the founders put into the Constitution. But the reason that passed is because they were one state away from an Article 5 convention. And so Congress said, well, it's about to happen. We're going to go ahead and pass a constitutional amendment ourselves through the mechanism that Article 5 gives for Congress to do it. And so I had some concerns, but the great saving grace is this. Number one, if the federal judiciary did what it's supposed to do, it would restrain a runaway convention. But I don't have much faith in the federal judiciary anymore, I'm afraid. But the number one, you know, dynamic in here that I do have faith in is the 3/4 ratification requirement. If it really is a runaway, goofy convention, number one, you couldn't get such a diverse group from all the states together and come up with a runaway, goofy thing, I don't think. But even if you did, the 3/4 ratification requirement is such a high threshold. I have some faith that it would not be result in a runaway convention actually getting something implemented into law. So that's it, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Good. The